thought you might have heard it all this morning, but it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Brigadier Retired Roger Mortlock. Roger.
Thank you, Sergeant Major. Ko tūmataunga te ariki, ka rangatira te mana, ki ora tāpa. Honourable Dr. Peter Sharples, Your Worship, the Mayor, Mr. Peter Butler, Colonel Clouston, Major Neil, veterans, their wives and partners, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to rain. Today, here at beautiful Oruawharo, I want to tell you a story. It is not a good story, but it is a great story. It's no secret that New Zealand is not gifted for preparing for war. And this was certainly the case when the first division-level training camp of about 6,000 soldiers was held here around Oruawharo in the summer of 1914. It was a grand experiment by a deeply inexperienced army. The level of military knowledge in New Zealand was so low that they borrowed instructors from the British Army at a ratio of one British instructor to about every 100 New Zealanders. Of course, these borrowed instructors were unlikely to have realised that the machine gun had come of age and was to be king of the battlefield, causing, before the First World War was over, millions of casualties. The knowledge level of these instructors was not that high, and certainly not up to the requirements of the war to come. Colonel Gambrel of the Hawke's Bay Regiment, in an unpublished book, gives us some idea of what it was like to be here. He said, camp was in an open field, the equipment comprised a bell tent, a candle, the ground sheet, and the bale of straw to house and bed 8 men. The soldier provided all other amenities. Cooks were provided from the ranks, and the field kitchens were of the primitive trench type. Training was, for the most part, elementary. Now, it is easy to look up at the windows of this marvellous old house and imagine the British Inspector General of Overseas Forces, General Sir Ian Hamilton, looking out the window. He was visiting New Zealand at the time and was later to be the General commanding at Gallipoli. What would he have seen? He would have seen over these fields behind you nicely lined up tents extending into the far distance. He would also have seen rain. Cold, torrential, unending rain. Because the country was so unprepared, the soldiers only had one uniform, which was soon soaked, and they had not been permitted to bring their civilian clothing to camp. It was then that Lieutenant Colonel Malone's 11th Taranaki Regiment appeared with its now famous lemon squeezer, worn gallantly by the Sergeant Major there. The Taranaki had squeezed the crown of the regulation issue hat to the shape of Mount Egmont, Mount Taranaki, in order to get the water to flow evenly off it. Mind you, the lemon squeezer was not to be universally adopted until early 1916, and they were not popular with the truth. So what happened next at this camp? The Auckland Star reported on the 2nd of May 1914. Divisional Territorial Camp Takapau. Rioting, troops, grievances. The outbreak was due to the effect of the bad weather on the temper of the men. Mutterings grew in the ranks of the 11th Taranaki Regiment, based at Retd, which grew in volume when it was further discovered that delay in railway transport would have the effect of obliging the country units to remain 17 days in camp instead of the regulation 13 days, and the town units of being 11 days under canvas instead of 9 days, without provision for extra pay or extra time in camp. Of course, there was more to it than that. The food was awful, and there was not enough of it. The men were not yet disciplined, and they had not taken to army discipline at all kindly. They were New Zealanders after all. The Auckland Star report went on to say that the rioting soldiers chanted, "We are going home Friday. Imperial Tommies treat us colonials like dogs. No work tomorrow. We want more and better taka." This chanting accompanied by the throwing of stones. Now the highlight of the camp was the divisional attack exercise, where all the training came together. Here are Colonel Gamble's comments on this. The divisional manoeuvres afforded good training for the officers, but the rank and file found long periods of inaction, followed by occasional rapid moves across rough country, rather boring. When finally they closed with the skeleton exercise enemy, the staff had some difficulty in restraining the advance and the expenditure of blank ammunition. In other words, the officers had not yet learnt to control them. Now remember, General Sir Ian Hamilton, the British Inspector General, was watching all this. In military terms now, what was he seeing? He was seeing a grossly inexperienced and unprepared army which could not even feed its troops properly, clothe its troops properly, pay its troops properly, train its troops properly, or control its troops properly. The truth was that very few of these military leaders actually knew what they were supposed to be doing. And the very next time that the troops began to gather was when mobilisation began for active service just 3 months later. Now we would like to think that the government back then had planned and organised well, that we had a good professional group of our own military instructors, that New Zealanders knew what they were doing, but that was not the case. The reality, underneath the legends of Gallipoli, was a case of the blind leading the disorganised blind. Well, the Oruawharo divisional camp ended in early May 1914. The men of the New Zealand division arrived in Egypt the 3rd of December the same year. There, the division had 5 months in which to train before deployed to Gallipoli. How did the training go? According to Private Cecil Malthus of Timaru, it went something like this. 06:30, physical drill, PT we would call that, followed by breakfast. 0800 until 1400, that's 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. A 5-mile route march with practice attacks and entrenching, followed by lunch. From 1530 to 1600, rifle drill. And from 1600 onwards, free time. According to Major Fred Wright, who wrote the volume on Gallipoli of the then official history of the division, training went something like this. Early every morning, the infantry battalions paraded in full marching order and trudged through miles of sandy desert. Like so much of the soldier's life, this work was not interesting, but it was necessary. With clothing designed for a cold climate, the long columns swung out along the never-ending sands, hardening the hardy ones, the cool desert slowly but mercilessly winnowing out the few unfit. He went on to say that the mounted rifles, the artillery and the engineers daily exercised their horses in teams until it was possible to have squadron and battery training. Now the soldiers before you of the 1st Battalion of the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment would wonder what the relevance was for Gallipoli of a daily 6-hour route march. Also today's soldiers will tell you that competence of only squadron level drills by mounted rifles, artillery and engineers is a long way short of what is needed to be competent at war. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to understand that the levels of military knowledge in New Zealand were so low back then, it is probable that the leaders did not know what else to teach them. And if anything, it was the Turks who taught them. because on the 25th of April, the New Zealanders followed the Australians to the shore at ANZAC Cove, Gallipoli, and the slaughter began. In continuing the story, I want to dispel a few myths. The truth is better than the legend. And over the last few years, scholars have produced some extraordinary findings, having found original papers that seem to have been misplaced for years. I refer in particular to the works of the Australian Brigadier Roberts and the ex-intelligence officer Hugh Dolan. First, the ANZACs landed at the right place, at the place selected and planned by not an incompetent British general, but by the Australian General, Major General William Bridges. Second, the landing was well planned by General Bridges, who made use of intelligence from spies, airplanes, and the first known use of military aerial photography. By the time of the landing, virtually all Turkish positions were known. The plan was state-of-the-art for the time, but it was also badly executed. Third, the landing area selected was, compared to other parts of the Gallipoli Peninsula, unsuitable for the Turkish machine guns. And this proved to be the case, as Private Cecil Malthus noted, that the actual landing beach was reasonably well protected from enfilading fire. In other words, the Australian General got it right. Fourth, the first wave of the ANZAC landings was not massacred by Turkish machine guns because there were none there. It only took 20 minutes to secure the beachhead. Our forebears were simply outfought by tough, trained, well-equipped enemy with good local knowledge of the terrain and who had fierce determination to defend their own country. Further, they were led by a man who in due course was to prove to be a world-class general, and that is then Colonel Mustafa Kemal. But in a classic New Zealand attitude, our forebears got on with the job at the cost of almost 3,000 dead and almost 5,000 wounded. After Gallipoli, the survivors picked themselves up, were reinforced, and went on to fight many more battles, usually at great cost. Their courage, endurance, and determination laid the foundations of a reputation that is fiercely guarded by today's armed forces. Gallipoli was not our greatest battle, nor was it our most bloody, but it was our first grand-scale battle. Its impression on New Zealand generated this ANZAC Day, which we commemorate for half a day each year. And all this really began here at Oruawharo, the divisional camp in the summer of 1914. It was a doorway into the future. If he had thought about it, General Sir Ian Hamilton could have prophesied what was going to happen. All the signs were there. Now, New Zealand had a population of just over 1 million people. It provided 100,444 troops and nurses to the First World War, at a total casualty rate, killed and wounded, of 58%. 500 died in New Zealand in training alone over the period of the war. New Zealand had one of the highest casualty and death rates per capita of any country involved in the war. Now, every year at ANZAC Day, we make a promise. We will remember them. But we remember a battle legend that isn't true. Yet the truth, to me, is much more admirable, much more informing. We do remember that these men and the servicemen and women that followed in later wars gave their lives in war. But if we see the Gallipoli experience through a clear lens, we would remember what can happen when we are careless with our armed forces in peacetime. Now that is something to remember.
Thank you, Roger. Donation to the officers' nest in the
That'll be the day.